Thanks, Wendy. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, depending on the different places you're actually joining from. Just to do a quick recap, so the last couple of webinars on the Prisma Access Cloud Management itself was focused on introducing Prisma Access Cloud Management and giving an overview on how the cloud management to actually go manage Prisma Access has evolved, and what are all the different features that we support today in cloud management, so that can help customers maintain a good security posture and then be able to configure network security and then the Prisma Access infrastructure itself in a secure way without actually exposing much of security holes and stuff. Just to kind of actually stick with the tradition of what I've been doing, where it's actually less of slideware and then more of the product itself, where I want to actually walk you through in terms of the configuration workflows, in terms of some of the advantages we have with the configuration workflow. So I'll be walking through those in this presentation as well. So in the last couple of presentations, I did actually kind of walk through the cloud management features, and then the important features related to cloud management, and also kind of give you an idea what are the additional recent features that we have done and stuff within cloud management. The last webinar itself, I did actually go through the onboarding of remote workforce, which was the mobile users, explicit proxy. So this is actually mostly how to actually onboard users who want to actually be secured when they're going to the internet, or the users who want to actually access the applications where the customers have their applications, the private applications, and the data centers or in their public cloud locations. When the applications are onboarded, how these mobile users are going to access them in a secure way. So we kind of actually went through that. Today, what I'm going to do is we talked about the remote workforce or the mobile users last time, right? Today, we're going to talk about the remote networks and service connections. The remote networks and service connections, they kind of the remote networks is for onboarding users who are actually sitting in a branch or like an office location. And these users, they're going to the internet to access certain applications or certain stuff on the internet. How do you protect those? How do you onboard those users and then define policies to protect those users, right? And then the same thing, the next thing what I'm going to talk about is the service connection. The service connection is more of think about a service connection as a connection to the data center where the applications are hosted, right? So how do you onboard service connections so that be the mobile user and then be the users who are actually on the branch, like if they need to access these applications, you need to onboard these applications as part of the service connections into Prisma Access so that they have access. So without any further ado, I'm going to just quickly jump to the product itself and then kind of walk through the activation, the remote network, and then the service connections onboarding, right? So quickly, last time I kind of talked about the cloud management console itself, like what are the different features and stuff which are there in a cloud management console. Just to do a quick recap, some of the when admins log into the cloud management console, you would see that there is actually onboarding workflows, which are right here in the middle. These are actually, we made this available so that the features can be onboarded into into Prisma Access in a faster way, where the admins can click on the launch walkthrough, and then it's a step-by-step process which says that, hey, all the necessary steps which are needed to, for example, configure remote networks. So it will actually walk through all those steps and then quickly help admins onboard remote networks. So that's about onboarding. And then we have the best practices, of course, where when you configure security policies, or be it like certificates and stuff, or be it like threat protection policies and stuff. So the best practices which are defined here, there are best practices rules incorporated into the product itself, where whenever a configuration is defined, the best practices checks come into play, and then they actually say that, hey, what are all the best practices that you comply with, and then what are the best practices you do not comply with. Just to kind of give you an example, like if you didn't attend the previous webinar, for example, here are all the security policies which are configured, and then we immediately run best practices assessment on it, and then we give a list of all the best practices checks which are complied, and then which are not complied, and then what do you need to do in order to comply with the best practices. So here is all the details, all the best practices checks, what the security rule, what best practices checks does it comply, and then what best practices checks it doesn't comply, right? So we kind of give an assessment within the product itself, so you don't have to actually go look for best practices assessments outside the product. So just switching back to the overview section itself. So this is the best practices stuff. And then also we have the optimize policy optimizer. The idea with policy optimizer is this is a ML-based algorithm, where what we do is when you actually define a particular rule, so we actually look at all the traffic which is allowed by the rule, and then what we do is after some time we actually come up with optimizations for the rule and say that, hey, it would be good if you can boil down the rules to actually different if the rule is actually overly permissive, then you can boil down the rules to actually strictly permissive, right? And then we give you the option saying that, hey, if you actually boil down the rules to the strictly permissive rules, then it becomes a very good security posture. You're not opening any holes in terms of security policies and stuff, right? So the optimize and then the best practices, the policy optimizer and the best practices are very key to the configurations within the cloud management workflow itself. So that's a very quick overview on like what are some of the key features that we have with cloud management. So switching to today's topic, right? So remote networks. So like I said, the idea with remote networks is you do configure remote networks to actually onboard on-prem users into Prisma Access. So the way you do it is, for example, we've got certain branch location in Tokyo, right? So I'm going to actually just click on the existing remote networks for now. Just one second. There we go. So what we've done is when you configure remote networks, it's critical that you define that which location that you want to actually, from which location you want to form the tunnel to the either a branch location or a site where a third-party branch device is installed, right? So it could be a third party, or it could be Prisma Access, Prisma SD-WAN, which was our CloudGenix acquisition. It could be any device which actually does an IPsec standard IPsec tunnel, and then actually is able to run routing on top of it as well to advertise the routes and then also receive the routes for connectivity. So here I'm going to just take an example of Tokyo, and then like we have a Prisma Access location in Japan, which is Japan Central, and then also within the Japan Central, right? So we have the node which is actually in Japan Central. So the question is, where does this node, how does this node get spun up, and then where does it come from, right? So the idea is there is something called a bandwidth management. The bandwidth management is you obviously have gotten certain units of bandwidth. This is actually when you purchase Prisma Access licenses, right? So you purchase these units, and then the units are actually nothing but the how many Mbps total Mbps that you the traffic, the overall traffic that you'll be sending to the Prisma Access. So what you do is, for example, I was taking an example of Japan Central, right? So just give me 1 second. Okay, there we go, Japan Central, right? So which is part of the Asia Northeast. So once you actually give like how much of bandwidth that you want to allocate out of the total bandwidth that you have to the Japan Central access location, and then the compute location is Asia Northeast, right? So there will be nodes in the Prisma Access. We call it the SPNs. So these service nodes will be spun up in the Prisma Access, and those service nodes actually they show up here, right? So when you click on saying that I have a branch location in Tokyo, and then Japan Central access location is the closest one, and then once you actually assign the bandwidth, this node actually pops up. So this is the node which will actually form a tunnel to the branch location, to the branch location that you're going to specify right now. And if you want to actually, if you have multiple tunnels to the same branch location, and then you want to do ECMP load balancing, you can actually specify ECMP here. And then, so what you would do is you would actually go and then define the IPsec tunnel. So for example, here, the IPsec tunnel is already defined. If I want, I'll just click a new one here. So I can say that, hey, I'm going to connect to the Japan branch location. You can give the tunnel name, and then you can select, we pre-populate, in a template, we pre-populate all the recommended ciphers and stuff, authentication, encryption ciphers and stuff, with the, which the third-party device is going to use. And then like you can select like what kind of device it is. So here it says Palo Alto Networks CloudGenix, right? And then also what kind of authentication that you want to use for IKE, right? Is it a pre-shared key or is it a certificate? You can actually specify those along with authentication option. And then the branch device IP address. So obviously the branch device which is sitting in that branch, like what is the IP address for? Obviously the SPN node, which is in the Prisma Access, which is in the Prisma Access to form a tunnel, right? You specify those, and then essentially, if you want to turn on tunnel monitoring, you can do that. If it's a proxy-based tunnel, you can give the proxy stuff. And then here is the IKE crypto profile that you want to use. Essentially, there is a default crypto profile, and then there is obviously IPsec crypto profile. So if this is anything different than like what default is specified here, you can do that. And then once you do that, once you save, you're actually done with the IPsec configuration. Then you can actually go to the routing here. So the idea here is anything that you need to get the remote networks up and running, you essentially configure it here in a single page, right? You can have a static routing, or you can actually have BGP to run on the tunnel with the branch device on the other side to exchange routes and stuff. So once that is done, like you're set up with the tunnel itself. So once the IPsec negotiates, the Prisma Access node negotiates IPsec with the branch node, you can actually see the tunnel come up, and then you can see the we do have the information on the tunnel, whether it's good, and then if the configs are in sync and stuff. So we do display that information. So a few things to note here is obviously we support an implementation called Cloud Blades with the CloudGenix. That means that we are able to onboard tunnels in an automatic way, where on CloudGenix, if you actually just go say that, hey, I want to go connect to Prisma Access, then the tunnels are actually onboarded in an easier way where you don't have to do all these configurations and stuff. So that's essentially the Cloud Blades implementation. So we talked about remote networks. The inbound access is more of like if there are applications running in the branch, right? And then you want to actually have some kind of inbound access, then you would actually have inbound access set up for those. I mean, it's generally a smaller use case, not that big of a use case. So we talked about the bandwidth management where you would actually go and then allocate bandwidth. So essentially you can actually go change, allocate, you can allocate bandwidth, you could go change it. Obviously, I'm not able to change it right now because this is a demo environment and like I have read-only access to it, but there is another environment where I can show afterwards where you can actually go change the bandwidth, allocate the bandwidth and stuff. Depending on how the bandwidth is allocated, the number of SPN nodes they change depending on the bandwidth allocated and stuff. And then obviously you would want to actually use, if you want to use DNS proxy, then you can actually specify DNS proxy settings. So you can specify DNS proxies. For example, if there is internal DNS servers for internal domains, right? You can specify the internal domains where the DNS request will come to Prisma Access, and the Prisma Access will actually proxy those to the internal DNS servers. And then if you have like separate servers for the public domains, you can actually specify separate DNS servers. And then also the domain list helps in determining, saying that, hey, what are the domains, like what DNS requests should be forwarded to the internal DNS servers, and then what DNS requests should be forwarded to the external DNS servers or the public DNS servers, right? So once those things are done, then you're good to go with remote networks. So that's pretty much all you need with remote networks. So on the same lines, jumping to the service connections. So service connections are fairly straightforward, as opposed to like the different connections you saw with remote networks. So in the service connection point of view, it's pretty much the same. You select what is the closest Prisma Access location, and then the region based on like where your data center is located. So for example, there is a data center in Dallas, right? So we selected the closest Prisma Access location as US South and North America. And then once that is done, you would actually form the tunnel. You'd actually, the same IPsec tunnel parameters are going to be configured and stuff, just like we did with remote networks. Nothing different, no difference here. And you can also set up the secondary tunnel. In the remote networks, there is actually we configured the primary tunnel. There is a way to configure the standby or the secondary tunnel as well there. You can configure routing, and then if there is QoS needed, we can configure QoS as well. So one thing in remote networks, there is actually QoS available for remote networks. It's just that the aggregate QoS, there was a change in legacy QoS and aggregate QoS. The aggregate QoS feature, the feature is not enabled on this tenant. That's pretty much it. But otherwise, there is actually an option to configure QoS for remote networks as well. So once the remote networks and then the service connections are configured, you can actually go take a look how the routing is like once you configure BGP and then try and exchange the routes. For example, for Dallas DC, I can actually view the routing table, like what kind of routes that we are receiving from the service connections and stuff. So here's the routing table, right? Just to give you an idea that like all the routes are being populated properly, and then there is actually connectivity for the users on the remote networks to reach the applications in the data center. So once that is done, and essentially what you would do is you would actually go and then define security policies, right? So I'm going to jump to the security policy section here real quick. So we kind of talked about security policies in the previous section, which is the onboarding mobile users and stuff. So obviously there are multiple targets just to make the configurations a little more easier to configure, right? So if you want to configure any like security policies specific only to mobile users, you can do that by selecting mobile users, right? And then if you want to do it for both mobile user and remote networks, you can actually click on share. So where like when you define a policy, it automatically gets inherited to both a mobile user and then remote network. So specifically for remote networks, now I have users who are actually sitting in the remote networks and then they would want to actually access applications, right? For those, I can write policies in terms of how they want to access the applications and stuff. So the policy application is pretty straightforward. I mean, nothing different here. People, if you're already familiar with Palo Alto Networks, firewalls and stuff, so we follow pretty much the same suite. It's just that the only difference you'll see is, like I said, like we have best practices incorporated. It kind of gives you all the best practices checks which has been run, and then tells you which you comply and then which you do not. If you use Panorama, if you use next-gen firewalls, like when you define a policy, you know that you need to define zones. There are addresses, there are users, and then devices for HIP profiles, destination, and then application URL categories. So depending on what kind of applications, and then URL. Obviously, for internal applications, the URL categories don't come into perspective. And then also, in fact, when you define advanced settings and stuff, right? So what kind of profiles that you want to use for threat inspection, you can actually define that too. So all, and then QoS, and then the log forwarding and stuff, which are like standard, like with the security policies, all those things come into perspective with security policy. And the idea here is we have like predefined the profile groups. Like if you want to, if you want to actually start applying policies in a faster way, and then you haven't decided what kind of threat profiles that you want to use. So what we do is, until like the admin figures out like what are the threat profiles that they want to use and stuff, we provide a bunch of best practices threat profiles where they can actually start using these threat profiles, and then the admins, the security admins, can go and then tune their profiles afterwards. So this is one of the other added advantages as well, where we provide the best practices profiles and stuff for faster adoption of the features, and then also for to secure the customer infrastructure in a faster way. So the best practices is kind of baked into, like we have a best practice profile, and then we have best practices profile for each and every threat related category as well. For example, vulnerability protection, we have a best practice profile, and the best practice profile kind of, if you click on it, it gives you on the details in terms of like what we use for different rule names within the profile itself, right? So the customer can view this and then can adopt this best practices profile into their security policies at first. So here it is, like we looked at the vulnerability protection, we looked at wildfire and antivirus, the same thing with DNS security as well. So we have best practices here. So one of the important aspects is, of course, decryption, right? I mean, it's important to decrypt the traffic, because most of the communication, client and server communication today is encrypted using HTTPS or TLS, right? So in order to actually make sure no threats are sneaking into those encrypted sessions, like you would want to actually decrypt those traffic and then be able to take actions based on the payload which is actually going into those TLS tunnels, right? So we do have decryption policies as well. The decryption profiles, obviously, like we do, we have like best practices decryption profile that the customer can adopt initially, and then they can actually tune their best practices. They can tune the decryption profiles afterwards, like depending on their local privacy laws or local company laws and stuff. So even the best practices profile, we have actually taken those into consideration and they've done it. If there are any other additional requirements for the customers based on the company policies and stuff, they can actually go tune their decryption policies and stuff. So that was really quick on the security policies, and then also like the best practices that we use by default. And the other thing that I wanted to kind of go through is identity redistribution. So what we do is today, when you look at identity redistribution, so this is actually more of how the IP to user or the HIP profiles, how they are actually redistributed across, let's say, the remote networks to service connections and stuff. So obviously, this is because like when you're defining user-based policies, like you want to be able to actually redistribute this to make sure that the when you define user-based policies, they're actually the nodes in Prisma Access, right? So all the nodes, they have this information to actually take action. So depending on the use cases, depending on some of the things that we have seen, we do this automatically, and then we give you an idea saying that, hey, for example, from the Dallas DC, right? We are automatically advertising the HIP and then the IP to user mappings, right? So in fact, like you can go and then configure what type of data type that you want to redistribute and stuff, right? You can go and configure. This is actually a more of an example where we have simplified the workflow, and then we are also given a pictorial view into like how the IP to user and then the HIP profile redistribution works, and then how you can actually control it in a more granular way. So this is actually just to kind of give you an idea when you're defining user ID based policies, where are all the IP to user mappings and HIP mappings are getting redistributed and stuff. So again, this can change. Like we are talking about remote networks, like when you go to shared, it gives you an overall view, right? So mobile user to service connection, these are all the different types of information which get redistributed. And then also from service connections to mobile user, quarantined device list is the one that is the one which get that information is the one which gets redistributed. So this is just to kind of based on the configurations, based on like what you want to do and stuff. We just give you an overall idea that what you can go and then configure to redistribute between like different types of nodes within the Prisma Access. So that was about the remote networks, service connections, onboarding, and then also the security policies, like what we have, and then the identity redistribution and stuff. So a couple of things. We do have a web access policy as well. The idea with web access policy is to make sure when traffic is going out to the internet, right, for an internet security admin, the policies are defined in a more easy way. I'm just going to take an example here. Like if you look at the regular policies, right? So in regular policies, keeping user as a context when he's going to the internet, right? So you define like what kind of applications and URLs that the user is supposed to access, or a group of users they're supposed to access, right? And then you would actually go and say that, hey, what are all the things that the user is not supposed to access? So with the web security framework, what we did was we kind of actually combined both of them, right? We have the blocked web applications, right? What are all the web applications that the user is not supposed to access? And then also we have the allowed web applications, what the user has access to. The same thing with the blocked URL category and then the allow URL category. So we are taking all these and then we are defining one internet policy, right? Keeping the user in mind, saying that what the user can access and then cannot access going to the internet, right? This simplifies like multiple policies into a single policy. So we take this construct and then we obviously on the back end, we are simplifying it in the front end for the users, but in the back end, obviously we configure it as multiple policies to the firewall, how they understand But for the user perspective on the management side, when they are configuring policies, or for admin perspective, when I mean by user, for admin perspective, it's a single policy where they can say that for this user group, hey, I have a single policy, what they can access and what they cannot access. And then they can, it's easier for them to actually maintain internet policies as opposed to maintaining like multiple policies for per user group. So this framework greatly simplifies the internet security policies as such. So with the web security section, obviously we provide all the options that you see in the security policy, but we have actually we have actually greatly tuned it to simplify a lot of these configurations and stuff. So for example, when you look at the security settings and threat management, right? So we have simplified to a greater extent, like when internet policies are applied to the users itself, and when the internet-based policies are applied to the users going to the internet itself. This is pretty much of what I wanted to cover with respect to the remote networks and then service connections onboarding. This again, the last session had a lot of content which was actually pretty long in terms of what I covered with respect to mobile user, because with Global Protect, mobile user Global Protect, there were a lot of options that I wanted to cover. Whereas with remote networks and service connections, they're fairly straightforward. There are actually not as many options as such to cover, but to kind of close the flow, right? The webinars that I did kind of walked into the introduction of cloud management, covered the onboarding of mobile user, explicit proxy, and stuff. And then today we covered the remote networks and service connections. So with that, I'm going to just take questions.